Alright, you spice heads, after a long wait, Dune Part 2 is finally here, and it's a big one. In adapting the second part of the first 1965 Dune novel, Denis Villeneuve has done the impossible. He has brought one of the most beloved and complicated sci-fi books ever to life in a way that's never really been done before. Welcome back, ScreenCrush. I'm Ryan Airy, and these are all the Easter eggs, references, and little things you might have missed in Dune Part 2. Plus, our take on what the ending means, not just for this movie, but for hypothetical Dune sequels in the future.
May thy knife chip and shatter.
May thy knife chip and shatter.
One note though before we get going. Pronouncing Dune words is hard. Different adaptations have created different ways that we think of pronouncing these words. In 1979, Frank Herbert himself wrote a fan letter with a pronunciation guide, but said you can, of course, pronounce the words in Dune in any way you wish. So, keep that in mind before you go too nuts in the comments with how I butcher some of these names.
You are not prepared for what is to come.
And I'm so excited to show you guys this new Dune parody Spice Crispy shirt we designed for our merch store, ScreenCrushMerch.com, where we design all the merch ourselves. I freaking love the detail in this thing. The sandworm coming out of the cereal bowl, how Snap, Crackle, and Pop look like the Fremen, and how it's made from toasted spice. You can find the link to our merch store in the description below. Now, like I said, we posted a Dune recap video just a few days ago, but I want to give you a very quick TLDR on Dune 1, just in case you want a refresher. Don't worry guys, this won't take long. Dune takes place in the far future where space travel is only possible by using a drug called spice melange, and this spice can only be found on one planet, Arrakis. An emperor rules over the galaxy, but two houses, the evil Harkonnens and the noble Atreides, are very old enemies. Long story short, the Harkonnens wipe out almost all the Atreides except for Paul and his mother Jessica. Jessica is a space witch called a Bene Gesserit, and Paul is basically the chosen one messiah of the natives of Arrakis. Paul has special powers like seeing the future and the Jedi mind trick.
Give me the water.
And he ended the last movie with the Fremen people plotting revenge against the people who murdered his house. And this brings us to Dune Part 2. Right away, the movie opens with Florence Pugh as Princess Irulan, a character who was not in Dune Part 1. She's writing in her Imperial Diary and says that it's the year 10,191. Now, Princess Irulan's diaries are a big deal in Dune lore, since the metatextual structure of the book is attributed to Irulan's future tense writings. But having Irulan narrate from the year 10,191 is the first way that Dune Part 2 changes the novel. In the book, a little over 2 years pass while Paul integrates himself into the Fremen and rises to power. But throughout all of Dune 2, it's still the year 10,191. Both the first and second movies take place during 1 year. Having Princess Irulan open the movie is also a kind of throwback to the original novel and the 1984 David Lynch film.
Hey, I've seen this one. This is a classic.
Now in the book, an epigraph from Irulan begins the novel, and in the Lynch movie, Princess Irulan, then played by Virginia Madsen, gave us perhaps the greatest expository monologue in all of sci-fi history.
Oh yes, I forgot to tell you.
This opening scene also introduces Irulan's dad, Emperor Shaddam IV, and their playing pyramid chess, which in the books is called Cheops. More importantly, this is our first look at Christopher Walken as the Emperor, a character who was not glimpsed in the 2021 movie. Shaddam IV and Irulan are part of House Carino, and although not stated outright in the dialogue, they're on the planet Khatain. Although this is Walken's first appearance as the Emperor in the Dune franchise, this is not his first Dune rodeo. Way back in the year 2000, Christopher Walken danced his way through the epic, gravity-defying music video for Fatboy Slim's song Weapon of Choice. The lyrics of that song are 100% inspired by Dune, including a reference to the Bene Gesserit superpower, the voice, as well as the refrain, the thing about Dune is, it's this complicated, galaxy-spanning space opera, but with very relatable character stakes. I mean, we root for Paul all through his journey because we relate to his suffering. I mean, he's lost his entire family. And all of us can relate to grief, loss, and anxiety. All my life, I have had anxiety and depression, and I always used humor as a coping mechanism that frankly just made the problem worse. Until I finally discovered therapy, and I'm telling you guys, therapy helps. And I can't even tell you how important this is. If you are feeling anxious or depressed, or if you just wake up every day feeling like something in your life is not right, then therapy can help you like it did for me. Maybe, like me, you're from a rural area or you just think it's impossible to find a therapist, but that is why we are proud to be sponsored by BetterHelp. BetterHelp makes therapy more affordable, accessible, and unintimidating, and they make the process easy because it's online and remote. By filling out a few questions, BetterHelp can match you with a professional therapist in as little as a few days. In our description, we have a link, and if you click that link, you'll not only help support our channel, but you'll also get 10% off your first month at BetterHelp. And guys, finding a therapist is like dating. You may not fit in well with the first one you try, so you can switch to a new one with no additional cost. You don't have to stress about insurance or who's in your network or anything like that. You can have therapy sessions as a phone call, as a video chat, or even messaging, whatever is the most comfortable version of therapy for you. So again, if you are struggling, consider online therapy with BetterHelp. Click our link in the description or visit betterhelp.com/ScreenCrush for 10% off your first month today. Now back to Dune. After the title of the movie, the first image we see is of the fetus that Jessica is carrying. Paul speaks to his sister, Aaliyah, who represents another massive change from the novel. While Dune Part 1 adapted roughly the first half of the 1965 novel, Part 2 covers the rest of that first book. But when it comes to Aaliyah, this version makes a radical choice. Because the movie doesn't contain a time jump, Aaliyah is not born by the end of it. Hey, who are you talking about? You know, Aaliyah, the super baby who emerges from the womb talking and kills the Baron.
Yeah, I don't get it. There's nobody named Aaliyah in this movie.
Well, that's a good point. Although we know this baby is Aaliyah, her name is never spoken in dialogue.
Where's the baby?
And it's only through knowledge of the Dune books that we even know this is her. After Stilgar takes Jessica and Paul to Siege Tabor, she's quickly told that she needs to become the new Reverend Mother for this group of Fremen. In order to do this, she has to drink the Water of Life, which is basically sandworm bile. Bene Gesserit have the ability to change this poison in their bodies, but it also gives Jessica a ton of extra memories about the past and the future and makes her unborn baby, Aaliyah, totally self-aware. In the books, the Bene Gesserit call her a preborn abomination.
Get out of my mind!
Not until you tell them both who I really am.
While the scene in which Jessica takes the Water of Life is fairly close to the book, the fact that Aaliyah stays unborn in this movie changes the book significantly in three major ways. First, Aaliyah isn't really in the movie as a small child running around creeping people out with a knife. Second, Aaliyah appears in this movie as an adult very briefly later in the film in a vision to Paul, where she is played by Anya Taylor-Joy. In this vision, Aaliyah tells Paul, "You are not prepared for what is to come." This very brief cameo easily sets up Taylor-Joy to play a grown-up version of Aaliyah in a future film based on the next book, Dune Messiah. And finally, because she's still in the womb at the end of the movie, Paul kills the Baron instead of Aaliyah. In the book, Aaliyah is known as Aaliyah of the Knife because she was the one who killed the Baron. This is how things went down in the 1984 Dune and the 2000 Dune on the Sci-Fi Channel, making this Dune the first filmed version without Aaliyah as a precocious murder baby.
Nick, I'm very disappointed.
Changing Aaliyah's role is a major departure from the book. However, with no time jump and the more grounded tone of the movie, this change makes total sense. And we think that this interpretation works really well. Although having Aaliyah telepathically communicate with her mother from the womb is still really trippy and ironically kind of hilarious. Now, we quickly learn that Paul's mom is the one who is primarily responsible for helping to promote the idea that both she and Paul are fulfilling the prophecy of the Lisan al-Gaib, or the voice from the outer world. This ancient Fremen legend is referenced throughout the movie and was actually placed on Arrakis by the Bene Gesserit thousands of years prior as part of their Mission Area protective project.
We gave them something to hope for.
That's not hope!
In Dune Part 1, the Reverend Mother told Jessica that the Bene Gesserit prepared a way for them on Arrakis. In the new movie, Paul says what your people did to this world is heartbreaking. Later, Irulan, who is also Bene Gesserit, says that
These are our own religious patterns, aren't they? This is our doing.
basically, centuries prior, the Bene Gesserit laid down the myths that Paul and Jessica can walk into, just in case those myths might be handy for powerful people to manipulate later on. This is like the extreme opposite of the Prime Directive in Star Trek, and also, likely, the basis for the still in production Dune TV series, Dune Prophecy, which will, at some point, have to show the Mission Area Protectiva arriving on Arrakis and stirring up religious prophecies. Now, throughout the movie, Paul is conflicted on how much he wants to embrace this manufactured destiny, and through Chani, we also see an active distrust of the Fremen religion. And yet another fairly big change from the novel, Chani straight up tells Paul that she can't mess around with gaining the support of the Southern fundamentalists. To be clear, the idea that there are more extreme Fremen fundamentalists in the South is a bit of a change from the novel too, since the word fundamentalist never appears once in the book. That said, Frank Herbert always intended the journey of Paul to be a critique of religious political leaders gone berserk.
I see a holy war spreading across the universe like unquenchable fire. Fanatical legions worshipping at the shrine of my father's skull. A war in my name!
So, although Chani's anger with Paul is new, it's also true to the spirit of the novel. As Paul becomes accepted by the Fremen and becomes a warrior known as the Fedaykin, he is given his two Fremen names, his private name, Usul, and his war name, Mudaib. The idea that Paul would choose the name of the desert mouse was foreshadowed in the first movie, when Paul was watching a film book on Arrakis and was really charmed by the tiny desert mouse.
Don't be frightened.
Even a little desert mouse can survive.
His private name, Usul, means the base of the pillar, and it's notable that Chani prefers to call him by this name rather than his war name. Once he gets his two new Fremen names, Paul whispers to himself, "Father, I have found my way." This references another scene from the first film in which Paul tells his dad, Duke Leto, that he didn't want to become a duke, and Leto told him,
"A great man doesn't seek to lead. He's called to it, and he answers."
Similarly, when Chani and Paul gaze out at the sand, she mentions that Aarrakis is so beautiful when the sun is low, which echoes the visions Paul has of Chani at the start of Dune Part 1.
My planet Aarrakis is so beautiful when the sun is low.
In the same scene, Chani is teasing Paul about the existence of rain on his home planet, and this references the way that Paul has his visions of Chani in the book when she says, "Tell me of the waters of your homeworld, Usul." This scene also existed within the 1984 Dune when Chani was played by Sean Young.
Tell me of your homeworld, Usul.
As Paul continues to become Fremen, he has to learn how to ride a sandworm. Now this scene is fairly faithful to the novel, but does contain one big Easter egg from the Lynch version. The Fremen tease Paul about calling a big one, and then when a giant sandworm arrives, Stilgar says,
"Subakisanai."
Teasing Paul about calling a big one is not in the book, but in the 1984 movie, Stilgar does say,
Usul, it's called a big one.
About an hour into the movie, Dune Part 2 introduces the biggest bad in all of Dune, Fade Routha Harkonnen. Fade is technically Paul's cousin because in this movie, we find out that Paul's grandfather is the Baron.
So he's Palpatine.
Harkonnen.
Your mom's a Harkonnen.
That is literally the truth about Paul's mom. Anyways, we meet Fade in the same way he's introduced in the book, at a gladiatorial contest in celebration of his birthday. Fade is called the Na Baron because he's the heir to the Baron's power. These creepy black and white scenes are filmed this way because we're told that that's the way the sun's light works on Giedi Prime at this particular time. This black and white light isn't something from Frank Herbert's novel, but it is something slightly reminiscent of the 1968 Richard Brautigan novel In Watermelon Sugar, in which there are gray days that change the color of the light. Fade fights captured Atreides in the arena, one of which is played by Roger Wan. Now this background character from Dune Part 1 is named Lieutenant Landville, but Roger Wan himself is the fight coordinator for both Dune films, and the guy who taught all of these actors how to fight in this very specific way, which mostly is a single-stick fighting style called the Balin Tawak. When Fade kills Landville, he says, "You fought well, Atreides," which is the same thing he says later when Paul stabs him in the final fight of the movie. Now the Bene Gesserit refer to Fade as the Prospect. This is because Fade is the result of their centuries-long breeding program to create the Kwisatz Haderach.
What's that again?
Basically, they want to create the one, a male Reverend Mother who can see the past and the future. With that power, he will lead humanity into a better future.
Powerful enough to bridge space and time.
Now, Paul was not meant to be a boy. The sisters told Jessica to give birth to a girl who would then marry Fade and cement a strong union between the two great houses. The Bene Gesserit believed that this could finally produce their one. We also discover that the Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother is the one who advised the Emperor to slaughter all the Atreides because they were dangerously defiant. So this is the catalyst that started everything. The Reverend Mother decision put Paul on the path to becoming the Kwisatz Haderach and destroying all of the Bene Gesserit plans. After his knifey birthday bash, Fade meets Lady Margaret Fenring, played by Leia Seydoux. Now this marks the first time this book character has appeared in any of the filmed adaptation of Dune, and notably, she appears without her husband, the character known as Count Fenring. Lady Fenring's job is to seduce Fade and carry his child, with the intention of creating a backup version of the Kwisatz Haderach. Fade and Margot's child is never mentioned in the subsequent 5 Frank Herbert penned Dune novels, but she does appear in the expanded universe novel Paul of Dune, where we learn that her name is Marie Fenring. When Lady Margot meets up with the Bene Gesserit, she confirms that yes, she's carrying a female child as requested. We also see Margot Fenning testing Fade the same way Paul was tested in Part 1, where he must put his hand in the box.
Is my hand in our box?
Also, when Fade meets the Baron after the duel, the image of the Baron just chilling in his bathtub and smoking spice gives me some serious shades of Jabba the Hutt. And no, not just because they look kind of similar. Now we have to mention that many parts of the movie are very much influenced by Lawrence of Arabia. Denis Villeneuve said that both of his Dune movies are inspired by that classic film. Paul obviously mirrors Lawrence, an outsider who is embraced by another culture, becoming a false messiah who leads the people to war. There are also some visual parallels to the Fremen attack on the Harkonnen harvest machines and the train attack from Lawrence of Arabia. The same is true of the final battle, which takes some inspiration from Lawrence's attack on Aqaba. Both movies are lessons about the dangers of charismatic leaders using religious propaganda to unleash a terrible war. Back on Arrakis, Paul is reunited with Gurney, who finally gets to play his stringed instrument, the balisette.
I've been playing the balisette actually since I was about 7 or 8 years old.
You're a prodigy.
Which is why I was hired for this.
In the books, Gurney sang and played as much as he fought, but in Dune Part 1, we never got to see him play it. The scene was filmed for Part 1, but unfortunately it was cut from the movie. Composer Hans Zimmer has long promised that Gurney would play the balisette, and finally, in the brief scene where Gurney sings a song about a still suit full of piss, that dream is realized. Infamously, when Patrick Stewart played Gurney in the 1984 version, his scenes of playing the balisette were cut. Making this balisette moment justice for 2 versions of Gurney. Now, while Gurney finally gets to play his balisette, Part 2 completely removed one major character, and that is Thufir Hawat. He is the Mentat of House Atreides.
What's a Mentat?
They are basically human computers who can process and calculate an immense amount of information. The last time we saw Thufir was before the Harkonnens attacked in Part 1, but he is completely absent in Part 2. Actor Stephen McKinley Henderson filmed scenes for the movie, however, he was cut from Part 2. And at this point, his fate is unclear, although he was likely killed during the massacre in Part 1. In the book, Thufir survives the Harkonnen attack, and then he is forced to serve them. He manipulates both the Baron and Fade to betray each other. Shortly before Paul drinks the water of life, he has a vision of Jameis.
Hey, what's Dr. Mimea doing there? Shouldn't he be in the Enterprise?
Well, back in 2021, before he debuted on Star Trek Strange New Worlds, Babs Alusamakun played Jameis in Dune Part 1, the Fremen warrior who challenges Paul, and thus puts Paul on the path to learning the ways of the Fremen.
I will show you the ways of the desert.
Here, Jameis gets a fantastic quote. A good hunter always climbs the highest dune before his hunt. He needs to see as far as he can see. You need to see. This quote is not from the novel, but it does perfectly capture Paul's desire for enhanced prescience. A good hunter always climbs the highest dune before his hunt is the sort of line that feels like it should be in the book, even though it isn't. Just more proof that sometimes movie adaptations can capture the flavor of something even better than the source material, like in the 1984 film,
Father, the sleeper has awakened!
So if this guy's dead, how can Paul keep seeing him in his visions?
Well, as we explained in our Part 1 recap, Paul sees fragments of many possible futures. There might have been a timeline where Jameis didn't die and he became Paul's teacher and friend. But Paul's visions of Jameis might also be more symbolic, where the lessons that Paul must learn in the present are manifested by the first man he killed. After the vision of Jameis, Paul decides to drink the water of life and fully become the Kwisatz Haderach.
So wait a minute, person. Why did Paul drink worm pee if he knew it was bad?
Alright, so this is the most crucial point of the movie. Throughout Part 2, Paul avoids going to the south, where the most fanatical Fremen are located. He doesn't want to drink the water of life because it means that he will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Paul saw visions of the Holy War. He sees that going to the south will cause the death of billions across the universe. Fremen like Stilgar are fully devoted to the Lisan al-Gaib prophecy. Early in the movie, Stilgar keeps saying that Paul is humble, even when he denies the prophecy. It's kind of funny at first, but it gets really dark when you realize that Stilgar and the other Fremen will justify and follow Paul no matter what. This is why Paul refuses to become the Fremen Messiah. However, after the attack on Siege Tabor, Paul sees visions of Chani's death. He realizes that the Harkonnens are going to massacre the Fremen if he doesn't follow the path in his visions.
Careful you must be when sensing the future, Anakin. The fear of loss is a path to the dark side.
So he decides to harness the Fremen to wage his war and drink the water of life to unlock his full power. He almost dies because only women can survive the poison, but with Chani's help, Paul survives and he fully unlocks his powers. Now seeing the future clearly, it's almost like a part of Paul dies.
All Atreides must die for Kwisatz Haderach to rise.
He is no longer conflicted about what he is supposed to do. He fully embraces the prophecy and uses absolute power to control the Fremen. Okay, so let's dig into the ending of the movie. Paul lures the Emperor to Arrakis, and then all of the Fremen take over the capital. Then, after killing the Baron, which again was something his sister does in the books, Paul basically challenges Christopher Walken to a duel, which sadly is not a dance-off.
Dance off, bro! Me and you!
Feyd becomes the de facto champion, standing in for Shaddam IV, which is all very accurate to the book. The only thing that's not mentioned is that this specific ritual is called Canley, which is a formal way to resolve disputes between houses without other people getting hurt.
So uncivilized.
Paul has basically invoked Canley, which is why all those guards aren't bothering to step in before the fight begins. Paul says,
"May thy knife chip and shatter."
Which again is something he learned from Jameis, who said that to him before his first knife fight in Dune Part 1.
May thy knife chip and shatter.
Before Paul defeats Feyd, he also pounds his chest in the same way that Jameis did during their duel at the end of the film. Now in a sense, Dune Part 2 ends the same way as Dune Part 1, with Paul winning a knife fight. But the way Paul beats Feyd comes straight from Gurney. Although it appears that Feyd has the upper hand, in the end, Paul has a knife aimed very low, which Feyd doesn't notice. This echoes the scene in Dune Part 1, where Gurney says,
"But look down, my lord. You're to join me in death."
Another one of Gurney's lessons becomes important in this movie. In his introduction in Part 1, the first thing Gurney says is,
"Don't stand with your back to the door. How many times do we have to tell you?"
Jessica says something similar in the opening fight of the movie, where Paul almost gets killed by a Harkonnen soldier when he turns his back on him. Now, we might be reading into this too much, but this might be a metaphor for Paul's story in the movie. With his visions, Paul is so focused on what is ahead of him, meaning the future, that he turned his back on what's behind him, meaning the past. He turns away from all his doubts about embracing the prophecy, knowing that this leads to a holy war. Toward the very end of the movie, we get another very interesting Easter egg for the David Lynch film, which seems to almost break canon. Lady Jessica and the Reverend Mother exchange telepathic messages with each other.
And then your Uncle Marshall and I had one of our famous telepathic conversations.
Check out Robin's date.
I know.
Is that who I think it is?
Which is not exactly an ability the Bene Gesserit have in the books, even though in the 1984 film they were straight up telepaths. These voiceovers also seem to honor David Lynch, who used a lot of voiceover in the 1984 film to capture the tone of Frank Herbert's novel. After the duel, Irulan agrees to marry Paul in exchange for her father's life, which technically gives Paul the throne. However, and this is where it gets a bit tricky, we're told that the great houses have rejected his ascendancy, and so Paul tells his warriors to lead them to paradise. So this is the start of Paul's holy war on the galaxy, which in the books happens in between Dune and Dune Messiah. Unlike the book, Chani disapproves of all of this and strikes out on her own to ride a sandworm. Throughout the movie, Chani is against the prophecy. This ties into what Chani said to Paul earlier in the movie.
"I will love you as long as I breathe."
You will never lose me as long as you stay who you are.
So she cannot stand with Paul now that he's no longer the man that she fell in love with, because now he's a man who's using her people to wage a war on the universe. And this is a really excellent change. In the book, Chani is pretty much fully on board with Paul, even when he unleashes a religious crusade on the universe. After Paul drinks the water of life and commits himself to the prophet's role, we as the audience lose our perspective of our hero. Even the people who knew Paul before Aarrakis, Jessica and Gurney, are totally fine with this war. So we need an emotional anchor now that our hero has become Darth Vader. And having Chani reject Paul's war is like Padme surviving in Revenge of the Sith and leading the rebels against Vader.
Oh, that would have been cool.
Frank Herbert has always been interested in exploring the consequences of the choices that Paul makes. Having Chani leave Paul adds so much more gravity to Paul's decision in the end. It shows us that, despite her love for him, Chani cannot support the man he has become.
This prophecy is how they enslave us!
And so, our perspective as the audience now transitions to Chani, with her being the new hero going into the next chapter. And this creates a far more complex story for the next movie. Now, in the novel, Chani had a son with Paul by this point who was killed by the Harkonnens. In Dune Messiah, she has twins, Leda II and Ghanima, which makes you wonder, if there is a Dune 3, will it be even more different from the books? So guys, big shout out to the writer of this video, Mr. Ryan Britt, who has literally written a book on Dune. You can find all of his links below. So, do you have any more questions about the ending? Was there something that we left out? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments or at me on Twitter. And if it's your first time here, please subscribe and smash that bell for alerts. For ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan Airy.